Landscapes. Let's talk about the quality and how do we get to various levels of landscape. A number of the images that I will show you are downloaded from a number of websites on the internet. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you three sites that you may want to go to see some of the work that's done. And I call it quality techniques for landscape because it's different than just taking a shot of a landscape. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go through some of these slides. I will always say, stop taking pictures. Photographers will say, what are you talking about? That's what we do. No, start making images where your mind will dominate what you're seeing and your camera is used simply to record what you're seeing and what the perspective is. So think about that. And one time I said, it is not the equipment that makes great images, it's the mind and the training of the photographer. Quality photographs, landscapes, whatever it is, really involves composition, lines, forms, what I will call containments, and I will show you those related to some of the images as we go through the presentation, and special light, backlight, side light, soft light, color of light. Quality images, quality landscape images, instant impact. Number one, and I think the most important aspect of any landscape image, if you want to submit it to a gallery or a competition or even on your wall, when someone would look at it, they would have an instant impact of that image. I'll explain more. Then excellent composition, and I'll go through all the elements of what I think make up an excellent composition. And post-processing. So many times somebody would say, well, when we did film, we didn't do that. Yes, processor did it for you. Now with digital, we need to do our own post-processing. Instant impact. This is what I mean by instant impact. When the next image comes to the screen, it will have instant impact to you. Instant impact. Quite a view, quite a scene, everything tied together. Instant impact. In the foreground, three-dimensionality. We'll talk more about that. But three-dimensionality, a foreground, middle ground, background, and what I call a place to stand. More about that also. Instant impact. Instant impact. Again. So, instant impact. You get the idea of how that should look to anyone who is judging your photography. Think about this related to a competition. The judge or judges may see over 100 images and they need to determine how many will be selected. And they will go through those 100 two or three times very quickly. And your image will hit the screen maybe for a couple seconds and they will then go on and look at the next image, the next image, next image. So they will remember that image or those images that have instant impact, because that's what they're looking for. They then will narrow it down. If they selected 50 out of the 200 and they need to have only 30, then the elements that we will go through here following this are the elements that they will look at to decide what image they will put into the exhibit. But mostly it's that first instant impact. Then I talk about a place to stand, and you'll see why I think that's so important. We read left to right, you see art left to right. Should something be in or out? No pure white areas and no pure black areas. Compositional elements, no pure black or pure white. This image has blocked up black areas. You're not seeing into it. You're not invited into the image. You can't see the detail. Here's one with deep shadows, but the photographer obviously understood the exposure and everything related to capture the highlights with detail, the shadows with detail. Beautiful image. Here is where the highlights are blown out. up in the sky in the upper left, there's detail up in there, but as you come down into the image, it's pure white, and that does not work. You must have detail in the shadows and detail in the highlights. Here's a very low light situation, but you see detail in everywhere except in the black areas in the back. And when I say no black, no pure black, or no pure white, that is in relation to, I'll use Ansel Adams terms, if your mind expects to see into the black area, then there should be detail. If your mind says you should see into the white area, then there should be detail. But in this image, your mind says, it's okay, that's a silhouette back there. I understand that. But in the foreground, everything has detail. All the shadows have detail. All the bright areas have detail. Here's an example of the highlights, and we'll talk about the dark areas, the light areas, the dark areas, light areas. I'll go into more detail on that and how that creates more three-dimensionality. And here's an image where there's some white area without detail, and that's on the buildings. Very much acceptable in this case. Everything else, where there's a light area or a dark area, there is detail and highlight detail, shadow detail. So a place to stand. I really came up with this concept many years ago, and I'll show you why. Here's the foreground. You have an ability as you're looking at this image to feel that you could stand there and see the image. You're part of the image. You're emotionally part of the image. Here's a place where you could be. You can stand there. You could feel that you could walk up to that tree. The more that you have an emotional response to the image, the more impressive the image is to you. So certainly from the standpoint if you could be part of the image. Here's one, no foreground, no beautiful image, beautiful composition, but there isn't any place for you to stand. Now let me give you a place. Maybe. It's too big. Sorry about that. Let me go on to the next one. Here's Yosemite. Not a place for you to stand. You're looking at the image. If I give you a place to stand, you feel differently about this image. You could be there. You can be part of the image. Go back. You're looking at it. Here, you're in it and looking at the image. So a place to stand is very important. Scrunch and stretch. This was something I created, maybe 2 years ago. It's in my Fine Art Techniques, Volume 8. And it's the idea of being able to scrunch an area without you losing the detail. If you crop, you'll lose detail. Here's an example. This image, really nicely done composition. The figure there is a center of interest. The foreground gives you a place to stand. You can feel that you can walk into it. But as I looked at it, the foreground was just too much. Really would like to have less foreground. If you crop the foreground, you would lose part of it. But if you scrunch it, meaning scrunch it together, all the detail stays and the composition has changed. See the difference between all that foreground and the bottom part of the image, scrunched together, kept all the detail. Compositional elements, left to right. In our culture, we read left to right. So your eyes come in from the left and look into a photograph, a painting, anything. And this came to me when I was studying a lot of the Renaissance art in my undergraduate courses. And I would see how the painter controlled the eyes. So here's an example of coming in from the left. And when you come in from the left, your eye automatically comes down to the water and the water takes you out of the image. You're really moving off the right-hand side of the image. If we flip this image horizontally and your eye comes in from the left, now you stay into the image. And the area on the other side, on the right-hand side of this, I named containment. It's containing your view back into the image. So you come in from the left and your eye stays within the image. Wonderful waterfall shot. But the problem is you're coming in from the left on this image and your eyes roam off into the empty space on the right and then off the right-hand side of the image. If we flip this horizontally, your eye comes in from the left and looks exactly at the waterfall and stays looking at the waterfall. And the area behind the waterfall is a containment. Another one, waterfall, beautiful, very pretty. And the figures in the lower or the middle right area, interesting. The clouds handled very well. There's detail in the waterfalls and the white waterfall. Oh, there's detail in the shadow areas. However, coming in from the left and moving through the image and then looking at the two figures, you tend to keep moving off the right-hand side. If this was flipped horizontally, you come in from the left-hand side, you see the figures who are then looking at the waterfall. You see the waterfall, the area on the right of the waterfall is heavy and darker and pushes your eye back into the image. So you come back and look at the two people who are looking at the waterfall. Look at the difference of seeing this way, and that open space to the right allows your eyes to move off the right-hand side. Now you come in from the left and all the detail on the right-hand side keeps you into the image. And you, in a sense, bounce off the right-hand side and back into the image and look at the people and the waterfall again. Quality compositions should be either in or out. And here's what I mean by that. Anything on the edge of an image should either be in the image or out of the image. In this case, the tree on the right-hand side is not really in or out. Take that out. We take that out. It gives you the center portion to see, but it seems like an emptiness. So if we go back to the other, there's that, what I would call a containment, but it's really not in and it's not out. So taking it out brings the image into view. But I think what is more important, if the photographer had stepped just a little bit more to the right and kept the entire tree in, then that becomes an interest in the image, and it's a containment to move your eye back into the left. So let's go back and look at the image with that on the edge. So it's either in or out. And when you're looking through your viewfinder, look for those things around the edge. Stop looking at what you're photographing as a main subject and look around the viewfinder. Look around at what's there. Anything on the edge, put it in or take it out. Take it out, I think it's an empty space. In this case, it becomes a wonderful containment to move your eye back into the left of the image. Either in or out. Up in the upper top of the image, you see these little tree limbs coming down in through there, up in that area. Very distracting. They're not in and they're not out, they're just there. We move those. Remove those from the image, you see how clear and the sky is there. Those are bothersome because they're on the edge. And that's fine. All the other tree limbs that are there are really in the image. But if you have just something on the edge and they're not really in and they're not out, then remove them or put them in entirely. Compositional elements, what I've been calling containments. Beautiful scenic image, beautiful landscape. The containment, remember your eyes coming in from the left. The larger area on the right is a containment. So in this case, we really have two containments. You come in from the left, your eye comes down into the center of the image, up to the right, and the larger mountain on the right is a containment to pull your eye back into the center. Also, for this image, the darker area in the bottom Move the viewer's eye into the center of the image, and the darker area up in the sky moves your eye down into the image. So in the center of the image, that's the most highlighted area in the image. So there's containments, shadows, and highlights, and your viewer's eye will always go to the brightest area. Containment of the stars and the formation of the stars over the tree, even more so of a containment. So the composition is that the photographer got down low enough to have the rainbow above the tree. Again, when you're shooting and you're thinking about looking through the viewfinder and thinking about what you're capturing, move to various different perspectives to see how you can place things in juxtaposition with everything else that's in the image. And containments are very important to keep the eye from going off. This was a marvelous containment. And here's an example of what I talked about earlier. The shadows have great detail. The highlights have wonderful detail and texture. Even the area behind the peak, there's a color in there for the sky. But the circular semicircle above brings your eye back down into the image. I'm going to talk more about dark and light and dark areas, but you can see it here. When this image hits the screen, back, when it hits the screen, you view right into the center of this image. Even though the sky is beautiful and all that's happening there is very beautiful, you still are looking down into the center of the image. So leading lines, talk about those. Darken the foreground, darken the top edge, as we saw in a previous image, and the viewer eye goes always to the lightest area. So leading lines, wonderful aspect. When you're thinking about shooting a scenic landscape, think about a different perspective. So many times in a workshop, I'd have attendees and everyone shoots at eye level. Get down lower at times. Here's a great advantage of getting down a little lower, which gives more importance to the foreground and leads you into the background. So changing perspective is very important when photographing leading lines, especially. Leading lines, taking you right into the center of and subject of this image. Even more so, leading lines. And here's an example of an image where something is really in the center of the image, not top to bottom, but from left to right. It's in the center of the image. The lines lead you in. Now, on the right-hand side, there's some white areas that are no texture in the white areas. I said it should have. This was simply brought down from the internet. Sure that there would be in there. It's very easy to have that kind of detail in that highlight area. But those leading lines, you can't help but follow where the photographer wants you to see. Leading lines and the foreground, place the stands. And it's actually a three-dimensional aspect. You have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, which creates 3 dimensions. And they are different tonal values, different highlights and shadows. We'll do more of that in a minute, but that is very important. So many times I see images projected and at what I would call flat. There's just all the same tonal value throughout the image. To have 3-dimensionality, think about the dark and the light areas. A leading line, getting down low and broadening the foreground. Getting up high would allow more the foreground to be shown, but in this case, getting down low with a wide angle perspective foreshortens it, flattens it, and leads you right into the image. A leading line. This is one of my favorite castles in Scotland. And I've taken workshops there. This is Elian Donan Castle that sits out on that little island. But a wonderful way of leading you right into the castle and the darker area up in the sky to push you back down. See where the lightest area is? It's just behind the castle. That's another aspect I will pick up on shortly. That is that if you have something dark against light, something dark against a lighter area, it becomes three-dimensional. Leading lines, not only in the foreground, but in the sky. Wonderful. Containments, leading lines. The sky is leading down. Everything is pulling you into the image. And then the third area is post-processing. How do we create three-dimensionality? What is the importance of contrast, color saturation, and dodge and burn? Shot this in one of the workshops I do out in the Southwest. It's in Chaco Canyon. It's a petroglyph. Soft light, it was in the shadow areas. Post-processing provided me the tools to bring out the three-dimensionality and the center of interest that I want you to see, and brings your eye right to where I want your eye to go, and have detail in the shadows, detail in the highlights. Ansel Adams made this area very famous. This is Canyon de Chelly in the Navajo Territory in the Southwest. And I do some workshops in there. And there are two things about this. One is on the left, that's how I shot it. And I kept maneuvering and trying to get a different position, but I couldn't remove the sky up in the upper right. So that becomes a little bit of a distraction because it's a lighter area, it doesn't tie into the rest of the image. So I simply expanded and cropped into the upper right area, increased the saturation, and this is really a personal taste. Do you like something more saturated, less saturated? There isn't any right or wrong. It's however you like it. I tend to like colors. So this has a little more saturation than most people, I think, would have for this image. But the main area, the highlight area, is the ruins sitting in the crevice of the mountain. How do we do that three-dimensionality? What are you talking about? Light, dark, light, dark. What about dark against light, light against dark? How does that create three-dimensionality? I studied Maxwell Parrish paintings also. He was in the 1930s an illustrator. And I thought, wow, there are certain aspects here that just stand out. You see where I have the white circles. There are light areas against dark areas, and the upper circle is a dark area against a light area. That creates three-dimensionality. Now, you think about this in relation to a painter. He has the ability to paint any way he wants to put the tones and highlights together. It's not the same as you standing out in the field and shooting a landscape unless you can move around, get there when the light is different, and watch for all these aspects of the light against dark. Now I'll explain that even more, but let me continue. You see the circle in the lower right area. If Maxfield Parrish had painted the background as he did the highlights in the upper right, upper left, behind that rock, it would not stand out as much. It wouldn't stand out at all. It sort of blend into the background. But by having that shadow area behind that rock, it stands out three-dimensionally. And the highlight on the hair, the rim light on the hair against the shadow area creates the three dimensions. Then the dark against the light. If he had painted the upper area, the upper left area, the same as he did with the rocks in the lower right, those two things would just blend together. So light against dark and dark against light. Then I noticed that there's alternating bands of dark, light, dark, and light. And that creates very much a more three-dimensionality. And as I watched and looked at a number of Ansel Adams paintings, and I was fortunate enough to look at his original paintings at the Art Institute in Chicago, and the more that I would see his work, things became clear related to what I just talked about and had studied with Maxfield Parrish. For example, Here's a dark area against a light area. And there's dark, light, dark, light, dark. If you look at many of his, maybe all of his images, he uses this technique to create a three-dimensionality. And I've seen the proof sheet of this image, and in that proof sheet, the sky is very light. So in the dark room, he darkened that sky so that that peak in the upper left area there could stand out against the sky. Otherwise, they merge together. And the dark area, the major dark area running through the center, was a little lighter than that. And so he created a darkened area, and it stands out against the brighter area of the mountains. And there's a little bit of a description, and he talks about this. There's a horse down in the lower right area, and the horse was standing there, not facing Ansel or even sideways. It was facing the mountain. And Ansel was standing on the top of his car. He had a platform on the top of his car for his camera. And he was waiting for the horse to move so that he wasn't just shooting the backside of the horse. And he was afraid he would lose that light where the horse was standing. And he stood there for 20 minutes waiting for this to occur, and it did. And he captured it. This one is in Yosemite, a very easy location to find in Yosemite. It's right along the main road in the valley. It's a great example of various techniques that I've learned by looking at his images. For example, here's a place to stand. And that came out more and more and more as I would see his prints. I was going to call them paintings, his prints. Let's look at the composition. This is what I call a containment. Ansel was very, very good at how to bring the eye back into the image. And you see the tree on the left, it's in. It's not that case of either in or out, it's in. And it becomes a containment. So your eye's coming in from the left. That large tree on the right brings your eye back into the mountains. And as you come back across to the left, that tree pushes you back in. For example, before we go there, here's the dark, a light, a dark, and a light transition through the image. Let's remove the tree on the right. I called it a containment. Look at the difference of that tree being there and being gone. Your eye now falls off the right-hand side. Here's the foreground. Let's remove the foreground. Let's remove the place to stand. Now you are looking at the image. You're not really feeling the image the same way as if you had that place to stand and be part of it. You're looking at the image. This is one of my favorites of his, and especially from it's a very famous location within Yosemite Valley, one of my favorite locations. But here's that example of the dark against the light. And someone might say, well, of course, the clouds were there. Well, he came by this location many times. If you read his book about shooting in Yosemite, and he worked in Yosemite, as a matter of fact, he would wait for the moment when he would see the clouds the way he wanted to have them. And then he would get to that location. But even more so for this one, not just the mountain against the clouds, but let's look at this over here, where the light is against the dark area of the mountain. If he had moved to the left, that would have pushed that weed into the clouds and they would merge together. So he was very conscious of a light against dark, a dark against light to create three-dimensionality. And here's the dark, light, 3 dimensions. Rule of thirds. Ansel's compositions are extremely strong. I shot this in the same location not too long ago, maybe 8 years ago, and it's a little tilted. And you look at this image and you think, oh, wait a minute, it's blocked up. Well, I looked at the histogram to be sure that I had shadow detail and highlight texture, so I could straighten it invert it in many ways. Here's the color version. This is really the way it was shot. This is how I needed to do the post-processing in order to bring out all the detail that's there. And then I converted it to a black and white. And guess what? There's dark, light, dark, light, dark running through it, which creates the 3 dimensions. And I was waiting for those clouds to move into the locations where the mountains would be against the lighter areas so that I have 3-dimensionality. So the mountain, which is El Capitan on the left, is up against the lighter area in the clouds. And the 2 on the right, the same aspect. And especially the far right, which is almost a containment because it runs up there and brings your eye back into the image. So I was very conscious from a result of studying Ansell's prints numerous times of how the composition should be and a place for you to be part of it. I talk about dark and light and dark. It doesn't have to be so many alternating bands of dark and light, but if you want the viewer to come right into the main area of your image that you are presenting, then darken that foreground, the lower portion of this image, darken just enough to push the eye into the center, but to keep all the detail down in that area. And up in the sky area, darken along the upper ridge enough to push the eye back down into the center. And then a little bit of dodging in the middle and saturation of the colors in the middle of the image. So that when this hits the screen, come back, you immediately move your eyes to where the photographer wanted you to go. Up in Italy, can have 3-dimensionality. So that we have the foreground a little darker, middle ground light, darker light. But reading left to right, this reads much better. If we look at it this way, your eye comes in, follows down the hillside and off to the left. This way, your eye comes in from the left, moves up the right to the hillside, and then back into the back areas. And now you notice even more, I think, that there's a darker area in the foreground, then some dark and light areas in the middle, and then a darker area above along the top of the image. Shot this in Tuscany, that's Pienza up on the hill. There's just a fog moving in, and this is how it is right out of the camera. And yes, there's a 3-dimensional aspect here, but not as strongly as if I can just add some saturation to it, which gives more of an emotional response. This is flat, even though there's the dark against light, and maybe one dark area, light area, dark area, but the saturation and the opening up of the shadow details in the foreground in the lower left. See how the darkness here, there's detail there. I knew I had it because I looked at the histogram, but I needed to bring that out and let those highlights hit the top of all the shrubs that are in the foreground. The darkening of the ridge along the middle area to lead you up to Pienza, the little town, and then darkening the top edge to bring your eye back down into the image. Post-processing. Here's a case. I'm standing, this is in Bisti Wilderness. They call it Bisti Wilderness. Strange rock formations. They do a workshop there. And I thought this was quite a composition. I was just standing, moving around to get all the elements put together, and I could see the clouds moving. Now I could wait for the clouds to get to where they would be a leading line, as well they would be an aspect of the dark against the light areas. This is flat, overall flat. If I use saturation, dodge and burn, I can change the image into a striking image. Bring out the colors that I really saw while I was standing there. Mountain scene. You can't help but look at that mountain right in the foreground and everything, all the leading lines leading up to it. But as you flow up through this image, from the bottom to the top, your eye moves off the top of the image because it's so much brighter than the rest of the image. So let's change some aspects in relation to post-processing. What a difference. Look at the three-dimensionality difference between how it's presented here and how the post-processing creates that three dimensions. Darker bottom in the bottom area, darker along the top ridge. Let's look at the previous. Bringing out the colors of the sky related to the rock formations. The leading lines coming in from the right area and leading you back into the mountain so that as you come across from the left, they bring you back up into those leading lines, bring you back up into the rock. And the upper area, although the sky is bright, where the peak of the mountain is against that, so it's dark against light. And then the upper top is dark enough with detail to bring your eye back down. Look at the three-dimensionality from here to here. Post-processing. Beautiful horizontal landscape, clouds, the road down in the area, fog really. The sky has beautiful leading lines coming down into the mountains, but it's flat. It's flat in relation to contrast and dark light, dark light. So let's look at the difference. Having that as a dark area along the bottom, dark area along the top, light areas in the center, and bringing out more of the color of the image. Flat, three-dimensional. Scrunch and stretch. This is that concept I came up with a couple years ago because I didn't want to just crop items or crop off items in an image or crop the bottom. I want to just scrunch it or stretch the side without stretching every other part of the image. This is a very famous location in Tuscany. Beautiful leading lines from the clouds coming down to the trees. You see the dark area along the bottom, just a bit of a darkening to push the eye into the center. So that's a dark, then the light in the center with the trees and a little bit of the clouds, and then dark at the top. Creates that three-dimensionality. But if I scrunch the bottom, because here, when I look at this image the way it was presented, the horizon is almost right in the middle. And I'm spending too much of my time looking at the lower portion and not as enough as the sky because it's a beautiful sky, or my eye is bouncing back and forth. Now, don't want to crop the bottom because if I crop it, I'll lose some of that beautiful foreground. But if I scrunch it, which just means squeezing it together, it brings the horizon down, emphasizes the sky and the trees. And I'm emphasizing the sky rather than the foreground because of those leading lines of the clouds that are pointing right down to the subject. Look how much more that I go back that you are seeing the trees now versus with more of the foreground. And I didn't want to lose the detail, so I scrunch it. That's in my Fine Art Techniques, Volume 8. Panoramas. Love panoramas. Multiple shots of a scene put together. This is, I don't know, a volcano in Costa Rica. It's one shot. That does not really show the essence of what I could see when I was standing there. Doing four-shot panorama and putting that together really emphasizes the scene from there to here. The idea of this also is very important. I do a lot of printing for people, and I want to have the best quality output print that I can have, which means I need a good amount of pixels. So if you're shooting with a wide angle lens, you could capture this scene this way. Well, let's say your camera will produce a 30 meg image, single 30 meg wide angle shot. Well, I did 4 shots here. That would be 120 meg image when I'm finished. I can then make larger prints, very high quality, much larger than I could have from a 30 meg image. So I will do the panoramas more than I will think about doing a wide angle shot. And that led me to having only one lens. I don't have a wide angle lens. I have a lens on my Nikon that goes from 24 to 300 millimeter. And I can create composites, I can create panoramas and have a large number of pixels for the final image. In Tuscany, single shot, not as interesting for one thing, but also fewer pixels than if I do a panorama, 3-shot panorama, 90 megs to start. I think this is a 5-shot panorama. This is sunset at Mono Lake. That's the Tufa. Mono Lake is on the eastern end of Yosemite. It's where I take the workshop for the evening light. Such a beautiful place. And I couldn't capture it in one shot. There would just be no way. And I wanted the larger number of pixels so that I could make a 40 by 60 print of this and have wonderful, wonderful detail. Multi-shot panorama. And the clouds and the foreground, just wonderful. You see the shadows and the highlights. Always think about how is the viewer, how is the photographer in post-processing, bringing your eye to the most important elements of the image. Not only do I do panoramas horizontally, I do panoramas vertically. So on the left here, you see the multiple shots I did of the scene on the right. And I wasn't on a tripod, I was hand holding, and you see that they're overlapping. Each shot is overlapping quite a bit. It's recommended you overlap when you're doing panoramas, you overlap by 30%. Well, in some of these cases, I'm overlapping by 50 and 60%, but the software is so good in just putting it all together. And you see, I have the foreground for you to stand. I have a leading line of that log to take you into the image. I have the containment of the El Capitan, the clouds, all the highlights in the center of the image. But I did it through a number of shots, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 shots, panorama, doing it vertically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shots of El Capitan and the 3 brothers. You can see at the bottom, those are the individual shots I did. They were overlapped by quite a bit. Again, I was hand holding. Software puts it all together very nicely. So consider doing those panoramas. So here are some very good websites for you. ianplant.com, onex.com, and upic.com. Very special. Here's Ian Plant's, all of those different images that he has that are just wonderful. You can just spend a day looking at all of his different work. Here is the images from upic, and you can click on inspirations, you can click on hot, the newest images. I recommend going to upic.com to see those images. This is onex.com, and you have multiple categories, all types. When you click on photos, it gives you landscapes, all kinds of categories, and they're worth seeing the various images that they have. This is my website. I'm really pleased I have it up and running again. It's at marianaphotography.com, and I have a number of gallery pages there that you can look at the images. But let me come back. You always think you have to have a better view. Let me come back to Ansel's various aspects of his black and whites, where he considers how he is going to bring the image in his view of the world. And he does that through a lot of darkroom work. So in the days that he shot, the film he used was a large format camera. It was an 8-inch by 10-inch negative. And he looked at the world in a way that he did for his compositions, but also in relation to the fact of how he was going to dodge and burn and do things in the darkroom. And so many times somebody looks at his images and thinks that's how he shot it. Yes, compositionally and capture a depth of field is how he shot it. But the most important thing was the post-processing that he did in the darkroom. So